What are the cultural, racial, attitudes and lifestyle differences between an African American and an Afro-Latino? For those who live in the United States, it is not so difficult to know the difference between an African American and an Afro-Latino. Although commonly a great majority of North Americans, both ethnic groups have something in common, is that they are Black. Something that perhaps you did not know is that both African Americans and Afro-Latinos are part of the Black community in America. But, who are Afro-Latinos? In 2016, for the first time a representative questionnaire of nationality in the United States asked the Latino population if they considered themselves Afro-Latinos. According to the results, 24% of Hispanics in the United States consider themselves Afro-Latino. In the 2020 U.S. Census, about 2.4 million people identified as Black and Hispanic or Black Hispanic, accounting for about 5% of the nation's 46.8 million people who identify as Black. The population of African descent in Latin America. According to ECLAC, in 2015 the Afro-descendant population of the region amounted to 130 million people, representing 21.1% of the total population. Also including the countries of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua are of Garifuna, Afro-Caribbean and or Mestizo heritage, as well as of Mosquito heritage. Those of Costa Rica and Panama are mostly of Afro-Caribbean heritage. Here are 5 things you should know about the Afro-Latino community. The community is larger than you may think. The majority of Afro-Latinos were born in the United States. The majority of Afro-Latinos participate in the workforce. Afro-Latinos have similar education rates to other Hispanics. Nearly a quarter of Hispanics in the U.S. self-identify as Afro-Latino. In addition, it notes that Latinos of color with Caribbean roots are more likely to identify as Afro-Latino or as Afro-Caribbean, compared to Latinos of color born elsewhere such as Colombia, Venezuela, or Argentina, 34% versus 22%. Regarding their place of residence, Afro-Latinos are mostly concentrated, 65%, on the East Coast and in the south of the United States. It is striking that, when directly questioned about their race, only 18% of Afro-Latinos identify their race as Black. In fact, 39% of them identify as white alone or white in combination with another race, 24% stated that their race was Hispanic, and only 9% declared themselves to be mixed race. When analyzing the genetic heritage of Afro-Latinos, everything depends on which nation we are talking about. As a result of the enormous diversity and racial miscegenation that is part of Afro-Latinos. The racial miscegenation between Colombians, Dominican Republic, Cubans, Panamanians, Mexicans, Brazilians, and Puerto Ricans has a different proportional value in each nation based on the percentage of Black Africans brought during the colonization process as slaves. Most of the Dominicans can be considered as mulattoes, to a lesser extent Black. Cuba a majority Black and mulattoes to a lesser extent. Brazil a majority Pardo and Black or Preto to a lesser extent. Colombia, Black and Afro-Colombian communities represent 10.31% of the total population of Colombia, a majority Black and mulatto to a lesser extent. Mexico, it is estimated that 1.4 million people identify as Afro-Mexican. All can be considered as Sambos and Blacks, a proportion considered insignificant. In the case of Haiti, the vast majority can be considered as Blacks and mulattoes, an insignificant amount. When you observe the difference in skin tone, Negroid characteristics and phenotypes associated with Negroes such as hair type, nose, lip size, you come to the conclusion that African heritage is predominant between 40 and 80%, followed by 20 to 40% white European, and to a lesser degree 4 to 10% Native American heritage are found in the vast majority of Afro-Latinos. Comparing them with Dominican Republic considered Afro-Latinos according to genealogical DNA testing, the genetic makeup of the Dominican Republic population is estimated to be 52% European, 40% Sub-Saharan African, and 8% Native American Taino. According to the latest data on the genetic inheritance of Afro-Americans, It is estimated that Black African inheritance is between 75 and 95%, while white inheritance is between 5 and 25%, and Native inheritance is insignificant. All African Americans are estimated to have significant ancestry from each of the three West and Central West African groups, Mandenka, Yoruba, and Bantu, with only modest variation among individuals in their ancestral proportions. When you see an Afro-Latino walking down any street in any city in the United States, your first impression is that you are looking at an African American, but everything changes when you hear the Afro-Latino speaking in Spanish. But, is that the only way to tell it apart? My answer would be no. Because both ethnic groups also have some cultural differences. African Americans follow American culture and Afro-Latinos follow Latino culture. African Americans, their style of music is mostly hip-hop, rap music, and R&B music. When we talk about Afro-Latinos, we have to mention the different types of music taking into account the nation of origin. Colombians, cumbia; if you are Dominican, merengue and bachata; if you are Panamanian, salsa and reggae, cumbia and salsa; if you are Cuban, rumba and Cuban salsa; if you are Puerto Rican, salsa and reggaeton; if you are Brazilian, samba. When you hear some Black in the United States listening to some of these styles of music, you can be sure that Black person is not African American. What genre of music did Black people make? Some of the most popular music types today, such as rock and roll, country, rock, funk, jazz, blues, rhythm and blues, were created and influenced by African American artists. Every genre that is born from America has Black roots. Hip-hop emerged in part as a reaction to the socioeconomic conditions in Black and brown neighborhoods. The culture was broad and not just about the music. Beatboxing, DJing, street art, graffiti, dancing, braids, hairstyles all emerged as part of hip-hop culture. Hip-hop was born in the Bronx, New York in the 1970s in African American and Latino urban neighborhoods. Hip-hop was a fusion of various cultural forces and influences. There is a big difference in the type of food they eat. Latin cuisine is as varied as Latin culture. No other thing in the Latin house is as well formed as history. Afro-Latinos. Traditionally, their favorite foods are chicken rice, cod, plantain tostones, tacos and ceviche. African Americans like cornbread, fried chicken, sweet potatoes, and chitterlings. Traditional African American comfort foods include homemade macaroni and cheese, fried chicken, red beans and rice, cornbread, seasoned greens, mashed potatoes and gravy, and ice-cold sweet tea. Although many of these foods are not considered the healthy choices, they excite our taste buds and warm our hearts. Other traditions that we have to mention is soul food, the foods and techniques associated with the African American cuisine of the United States. The term was first used in print in 1964 during the rise of Black Pride, when many aspects of African American culture, including soul music, were celebrated for their contribution to the American way of life. When we talk about Black culture, what are we talking about? Black culture is a lifestyle standard made of assumptions about Black identity, often used successfully by marketers, studio heads, fashion brands and music labels to make money. It can be the cool factor that makes kids line up for hours to spend their last dime on brand new Michael Jordan sneakers. When we talk about the difference in religious beliefs between Afro-Latinos and African Americans, Protestantism has long dominated the religious landscape of African Americans, although some practice Catholicism and non-Christian religions. About 1 in 5 Black Americans, 21%, are not affiliated with any religion and instead identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. African traditions celebrated in by Black Americans. We have to talk about Kwanzaa is a week-long celebration of African American culture and heritage. This secular holiday takes place every year from December 26 to January 1, and is observed by millions of people in the United States and around the world. Another type of celebration that African Americans also celebrate is a holiday. Juneteenth commemorates the effective end of slavery in the United States. Juneteenth, short for June 19th, marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and ensure that all enslaved people be freed. The vast majority of Afro-Latinos are practicing Catholics. Some identify themselves as Jehovah's Witnesses and evangelical Christians. Others are also influenced and practice a form of religious syncretism between the Catholic religion and African beliefs. Most Hispanics venerate the Virgin Mary in all its popular expressions and different names, through processions, prayers, or making promises, also many of them religious traditions associated with Holy Week. Both ethnic groups have something in common, and it is the word Afro, which tells you that both ethnic groups are descendants of the first black African slaves, who arrived on the American continent during the time of slavery. Some historians consider this time as one of the worst in American history, when the slave system was an important part of the English colonies in North America. Slavery system which was also part of all Latin American and Caribbean nations, territories which were part of colonies that were under the rule of the Spanish, French, and Portuguese. In each of the Latin American nations and Caribbean islands, the word Afro-Latino does not have any kind of historical cultural meaning. The term Afro-Latino is only used by academics within the North American territory, as a way to offer you a clearer idea of which racial ethnic group they are talking about. The term Afro-American was created during the 60s, as a form of political strategy to reduce the negative effects of negative stereotypes associated with the word black within the United States, but also as a way to identify their pride as black descendants of African slaves in America. The traditions of the African American culture that are practices among family are maintaining family relationships, practicing Christianity, maintain hospitality, gaining education, and cooking. In the African American culture, families maintain a strong bond, though many function like family reunions. Despite the ignorance and insensitivity of their oppressors, they instilled in their children the values of honesty, integrity, and treating their fellow humans with compassion, an attitude that prevails in many modern African American families. African cultures, slavery, slave rebellions, and the civil rights movements have shaped African American religious, familial, political, and economic behaviors. The imprint of Africa is evident in a myriad of ways, in politics, economics, language, music, hairstyles, fashion, dance, religion, cuisine, and worldview. What is unique about African American culture? African American identity was established during the period of slavery, producing a dynamic culture that has had and continues to have a profound impact on American culture as a whole, as well as that of the broader world. Elaborate rituals and ceremonies were a significant part of African Americans' ancestral culture. Both African Americans and Afro-Latinos prefer to identify themselves mostly as black or simply black. I particularly prefer to use the phrase black who speaks Spanish. In the case of African Americans, English-speaking blacks. The why of my reasoning? Black or Afro-Latino can only talk about the racial connection and some African cultural heritage that still persists in some black populations on the American continent. Our racial heritage is African, but our culture is Latina. Both the black population in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the black population within North American territory, have a common history when we speak of the slavery era during the 16th century. But both black populations went through different historical events that marked in different directions the perception of racial identity, but also the acceptance of national identity. African Americans within the United States, their racial identification part of the rule of a single drop of blood. Only a single black blood is enough for you to be considered black. Imposition of racial identification imposed on blacks as a way for whites to maintain the purity of the race. On the contrary, Afro-Latinos, their racial identification is based on the color of their skin. Racial classification, which is historically associated with the racial caste system imposed by the Spanish on their colonies in America. When Latinos come to the United States, especially those who present a racial mixture, regardless of how this is translated in terms of skin color, they face a culture shock caused by the predominant racial paradigm in the United States based on white against black. Many Latinos, especially those from countries with a greater number of racially biracial citizens, are accustomed to broader racial conceptualizations. Many Latin American and Caribbean countries have a ternary model of race relations that acknowledges intermediate populations of multiracial individuals. African Americans don't recognize the different racial mixtures that result from the one drop of blood rule in their racial classification. Afro-Latinos at this time use these different racial mixes to create a personal self-identification based on these different racial categories. Racial categories which can only be identified using different skin color tones, hair type and some characteristics, phenotypes, that reflect a racial identity which the individual accepts as his own. We must also say that these categories are only used by individuals who do not fall within the original racial categories, Black, White, Native American. What are the differences between Afro-Latinos and African Americans? Both Afro-descendant groups have different cultural preferences, different feelings of racial identity, speak different languages, but also as a community they have a different vision of themselves. African Americans have a low sense of belonging and acceptance that they are part of a nation, compared to Afro-Latinos who have a high sense of national identity. Black Latinos living in the United States do not look to Africa as a mechanism of ethnic cultural identification. On the contrary, they all enjoy, promote, defend and go beyond all the cultural and popular manifestations of their countries of origin. An African American can walk through the streets of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, through the most popular neighborhoods of Cali in Colombia, or along the Brazilian coast of Rio de Janeiro. Believe me, no one will notice that he or she is a gringo or dark American. The same thing happens with any black walking through a black neighborhood in New York, Chicago or Atlanta. No one will notice that they are looking at an Afro-Latino. Everything changes when they try to talk to anyone around them. That tells you that no matter what nation in the world they are, when it comes to being black, between an Afro-Latino, Afro-American or any black African there is not much difference. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like the content of this video, please click the like button, but above all let me know your opinion in your comments. Thank you.